I'm Carol Christ. I'm the Vice Chancellor and Provost. Before I introduce this series, I'd like to tell you all, in case you haven't heard, that Cal beat Princeton 55-52. I'd like to welcome you to the Berkeley Writers at Work series. We do many kinds of research on the Berkeley campus, and one of the things I've learned as Vice Chancellor is how different these research worlds are. However, we're all writers. Writing is the way we convey the results of our research. This series is designed to make public how we write. How do we get an idea for an article or a book? How do we begin writing about it? How do we organize it? How do we revise, edit? Who reads our work in progress? These are issues that all writers face, whether they're doing reports for the campus or books for publication. This series highlights Berkeley writers, of which there are many splendid examples. I'd now like to introduce Carolyn Porter, a writer herself, and the Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Undergraduate and Interdisciplinary Studies to introduce our first writer.
Thank you, Carol. Your introduction made me recall that when I first came to Berkeley, more years ago than I want to admit, one of the few people who volunteered to read my dissertation at the time was Carol Christ. So we really, it is the case that it's crucial to have people read your work in progress. I can testify. I'd like first to introduce Steve Tollison, gentleman on my right here, who is a lecturer in the college writing programs. The college writing program, which is currently directed by Glenda Hull, who's seated right back there, is mounting this series, and we're very excited about it in my unit, UGIS, which is involved with the college writing program. Steve Tollefson is also a mainstay of that program. He's the author of 4 books. He tells me the best known of them are Grammargrams and Grammargrams 2. I'd love to know what Grammargrams are. And he is a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, a very highly valued award on this campus. And he will be interviewing our speaker, our first in this series of Writers at Work. And that person is, of course, as you all know, Professor Ronald Takaki. We're very, very pleased to initiate this series with such a distinguished writer, professor, teacher, and colleague. Professor Takaki is one of the foremost nationally recognized scholars of multicultural studies. He is himself the grandson of Japanese immigrant plantation laborers. He holds a PhD in American history from this university, UC Berkeley, where he has been a professor of ethnic studies now for over 2 decades. The Berkeley faculty has honored Professor Takaki with a Distinguished Teaching Award as well, not least because he established, in effect, Berkeley's multicultural requirement, or he helped very centrally to establish the requirement for graduation. Professor Takaki has lectured in many countries, including Japan, the former Soviet Union, and South Africa. He is the author of many books. We'll just mention a few. The critically acclaimed Iron Cages, Race and Culture in 19th Century America, which appears as a reference, I'm sure, in thousands of American history books by now. His book, Strangers from a Different Shore, A History of Asian Americans, was selected by the New York Times as one of the notable books of the year. His most recent book is entitled Hiroshima, Why America Dropped the Atom Bomb. And I just overheard him describing a project he's, I think, working on off of that. His book, A Different Mirror, A History of Multicultural America, has been hailed by Publishers Weekly as a brilliant revisionist history of America that is likely to become a classic of multicultural studies. It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce Ron Takaki.
Thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank the college writing programs for bringing us together like this in such an elegant setting. Special thanks to Steve for organizing this particular event. Thanks to Vice Chancellor Christ for gracing our gathering with your presence. And Carolyn Porter, it's good to be working with you like this for an event related to your writing program. What I'd like to do before I give you some readings from some selections is to try to contextualize my reading. As you know, there is what can be called a master narrative of American history. And the master narrative goes something like this. America is the land of liberty, democracy, and equality. What about racism? Well, racism existed, but it's an aberration. This is the master narrative that you would find, say, in the writings of historians, eminent historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who wrote this polemic recently entitled The Disuniting of America. But this is a master narrative that is pervasive. It's like it's in the air, you know? And when you listen carefully, you will hear it almost everywhere, even in pronouncements made frequently by members of our Board of Regents, you know, about what America is and who Americans are. Well, in all of my scholarly writings, I've been striving to reach toward a counter master narrative, a master narrative that would be more inclusive, more comprehensive, and more accurate, one that would view our society and its past in terms of its complexities and also its contradictions. And so what I'd like to do for my reading is just to share with you some of this counter master narrative. And I'd like to begin with my book entitled A Different Mirror, because I think that this is a book that offers a way to look at our past, you know, differently, to what I call revision American history. And it begins with an anecdote. But think about, you know, this is a writing event. Think about the way I utilize an anecdote to try to address some deep and powerful issues in U.S. history. And it opens. I had flown from San Francisco to Norfolk and was riding in a taxi to my hotel to attend a conference on multiculturalism. Hundreds of educators from across the country were meeting to discuss the need for greater cultural diversity in the curriculum. My driver and I chatted about the weather and the tourists. The sky was cloudy and Virginia Beach was 20 minutes away. The rear view mirror, we were both looking at each other through the rear view mirror and chatting. The rear view mirror reflected a white man in his 40s, and he asked, "How long have you been in this country?" And I replied, wincing, "All my life." And I said I was born in the United States. With a strong Southern drawl, he then remarked, "I was wondering, because your English is excellent." Now, this was not a Southern thing, okay, because Northerners have also asked me the same question. And this was not a class thing, because PhDs have also asked me the same question. But then I said to myself, "Ron, you know, lighten up, lighten up." Then, as I had many times before explained, my grandfather came here from Japan in the 1880s. My family has been here in America for over 100 years. He glanced at me in the mirror. Somehow, I did not look American to him. My eyes and complexion looked foreign. Suddenly, we both became uncomfortably conscious of a racial divide separating us. An awkward silence turned my gaze from the mirror to the passing landscape, the shore where the English and the Powhatan Indians first encountered each other, Our highway was on land that Sir Walter Raleigh had renamed Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. In the English cultural appropriation of America, the indigenous peoples themselves would become outsiders in their native land. Here at the eastern edge of the continent, I mused, was the site of the beginning of multicultural America. Jamestown, the English settlement founded in 1607, was nearby. The first 20 Africans were brought here a year before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock. Several hundred miles offshore was Bermuda, the Bermudes, where William Shakespeare's Prospero had landed and met the native Caliban in The Tempest. Earlier, another voyager had made an Atlantic crossing and unexpectedly bumped into some islands in the south. Thinking he had reached Asia, Christopher Columbus mistakenly identified one of the islands as Simpango, Japan. In the wake of the admiral, many peoples would come to America from different shores, not only from Europe, but also from Africa and Asia. One of them would be my grandfather. My mental wandering across terrain and time ended abruptly as we arrived at my destination. I said goodbye to my taxi driver and I went into the hotel, carrying a vivid reminder of why I was attending this conference. So that's how A Different Mirror opens. But I'd like to then jump back to a book that I've written a long time ago called Iron Cages. And I utilize literature a lot, not only as historical documents, but I try to bring literature into my own service as a writer. And I end this book, which was published by Knopf a long time ago in 1979, with Ahab, Captain Ahab, on board the Pequod, chasing the white whale Moby Dick. Okay? And the passage I'd like to read to you is, what about those who were below deck? And the Pequod was like a symbol of America. It was a multiracial crew. There was an African, an American Indian, a South Pacific Islander, and also Asians on board this ship that had also white Americans. But the question and we know how that story ended, they all died except for the lone survivor. But the question I had to ask was, why is it that they did not stop Ahab? Okay. Under their captain's hegemony, the Pequod workers are unable to do what the slave Babu of the story Benito Senorino knows he must do in order to survive and to be free. Unlike Babu, the leader of a black rebellion on board the slaver San Dominique, they do not outwardly follow the orders of their master while carrying the knife of revolution. Neither do they do what Bartleby does, refuse to work. Had they, like the scrivener portrayed in Melville's short story, declared their great refusal, saying that they preferred not to chase the great white whale, they would have torpedoed Ahab's mission. But they are unable even to commit civil disobedience, for they lack the political consciousness, the awareness of their own class interests, as well as the recognition of Ahab's madness, necessary for resistance. Where Bartleby understands his oppression, his mechanical labor in a law office, which is likened to a factory, and hence able to rebel against a world of legal forms and dead letters, the Pequod crew, except for Starbuck and Ishmael, are blind to the disaster awaiting them, and hence are unable to save themselves. They cannot choose alternatives as long as none is seriously proposed. And they cannot propose a relevant measure of fundamental opposition to Captain Ahab as long as they have no critical understanding of what is occurring on their ship. But their situation, even more than Bartleby's, demands that they respond. Bartleby merely opposes the absurd while they face the demonic. I'd like to turn now to the people themselves who came over here from different shores. And I'd like to just read you just a short excerpt from my book, Strangers from a Different Shore. And this is a story told by a Japanese immigrant woman. And I liked her story because it told us something about herself and her encounter with this new world called America. And this new world particularly was the Central Valley of California. And I like to think of nature, as part of the experience, okay? So this paragraph opens, "A wind came up behind the strangers. Shortly after she had arrived in the San Joaquin Valley, a young Japanese bride stood alone in the darkness outside of her house. If I looked really hard, I could see faintly glowing in the distance one tiny light. And over there I could see another, and over there another. And I knew that that was where people lived. More than feeling sabishi, lonely, I felt samui, cold. It was so cold, it was beyond loneliness. It was cold. The migrants began to sense that they had traversed new boundaries, some of them not defined by geography, and they anxiously gathered memory around themselves." Well, there were some tragedies, many tragedies, in fact, that happened to these real, members of the Pequot. About 2 million Jews fled from Russia and Poland, came to these shores, and many of them settled in the Lower East Side where they worked in the garment industries. And many of these workers were young Jewish women. And in Jewish American history, there is an event that is deeply remembered, and this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. I don't know how many of you know about this fire, but let me just read you my description of what happened. "Constituting over 1/3 of the garment industry's workforce in 1910, these young women labored in dangerous and cramped conditions. In these sweatshops, they were literally packed together. On floor after floor, they worked elbow to elbow at sewing machines in row after row of long tables. We are so crowded together," they said, "that there is not an inch of space. The machines are so close together that there is no way to escape in case of emergency." That's sick. An emergency did happen on March 26, 1911, when a fire suddenly exploded at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. 800 workers, mostly young women, were trapped in the burning building. A stream of fire tore up through the elevator shaft and stairways to the upper floors. Fire instantly appeared at all windows, and tongues of flames crept higher and higher along the walls to where little groups of terrified girls, workers, stood in confusion. Screaming, struggling, they jumped from windows, some from the 9th floor, their bodies smashing on the sidewalks. One girl after another fell like shot birds from above, from the burning floors, wrote Morris Rosenfeld in his account based on eyewitness reports. They hit the pavement like hail, a fireman at the scene reported. We could hear the thuds faster than we could see the bodies fall. Jumping from the high floors, the girls came down with such force that they tore the nets from the grasp of firemen or snapped the cords. Unable to escape, 146 young workers, mostly Jewish and Italian, died in the smoke and the heat of the inferno. There were so many bodies, they could not all be taken away in ambulances and patrol cars. Grocers and peddlers offered their wagons and push carts. Well, there's more to this story, though, when we look at the broad canvas. These people were not just victims, they were also actors. They were actors in history, okay? And I'd like to just end my reading by telling you about an action that happened in California, on the other side of this continent, in a small town called Oxnard, California, in 1903. Not many people know about this event, but it's an event that I would like to remember. In Oxnard, California, at the turn of the century, we had immigrant Mexican workers and immigrant Japanese workers pitted against one another, working side by side in the fields of California. And in Oxnard, they were harvesting sugar beets. And in 1903, they went out on strike together, and I'd like to just tell you about this strike. Protesting wage cuts, 200 Mexican farm workers joined hundreds of fellow Japanese laborers in a 1903 strike at Oxnard, California. Together, the two groups organized the Japanese-Mexican Labor Association. The strikers elected Kosaburo Baba as president, T. Yamaguchi as secretary of the Japanese branch, and J.M. Lazarus as secretary of the Mexican branch. At their union meetings, discussions were conducted in both Japanese and Spanish, with English serving as a common language for both groups. For the first time in the history of California, two minority groups feeling a solidarity based on class had come together to form a union. Here was a West Coast version of the Giddy Multitude. Well, these Japanese and Mexican workers won their fight. They won their demand for higher wages. Flushed with victory, the Mexican secretary of the union, Lazarus, petitioned the American Federation of Labor to charter their organization as the Sugar Beet Farmers Union of Oxnard. So they wanted affiliation with the FFL. Samuel Gompers, the president of the FFL, wrote a letter saying that he will accept the Mexican laborers, but he said, your union will under no circumstances accept membership of any Chinese or Japanese. This requirement contradicted the very principles of the Oxnard strike. And this is what Lazarus wrote in response to Gompers. And I'd just like to read to you from his letter. He said, we beg to say in reply that our Japanese brothers here were the first to recognize the importance of cooperating and uniting in demanding a fair wage scale. In the past, we have counseled, fought, and lived on very short rations with our Japanese brothers and toiled with them in the fields, and they have been uniformly kind and considerate. We would be false to them and to ourselves and to the cause of unionism if we now accepted privileges for ourselves which are not accorded to them. We will refuse any other kind of charter except one which will wipe out race prejudice and recognize our fellow workers as being good as ourselves. I am ordered by the Mexican Union to write this letter to you, and they fully approve its words. But I think this is part of our hidden American history, where peoples of different groups have come together to create a new economy. But in the coming together, in the working together, there were conflicts, there were antagonisms, even violence. But there were also these moments, where they transcended their ethnic identity, became more than Mexican, say, more than Japanese. And this is a pretty important process, okay? And you saw it in Oxnard, you can see it happening throughout American history, actually, and you can see it happening today. Thank you for letting me share some of my readings with you. I hope maybe some of you will now maybe read my books. But to kind of titillate you a little bit more, my colleague Steve Tollefson is going to join me now and ask me some questions. Now, I have to warn you, all of this is live, we had lunch together, and Steve said, I have 5,000 questions to ask you. And I said, don't tell me any of them, Okay, so I don't know what he's going to ask me.
As Ron was setting out his books and I was setting out my books, I felt like we were sort of warring camps here with all of our various things marked. The way Ron read made me think that I have sort of a larger task even than I thought, which was a big task to begin with, and that is to demystify to some extent what he does. We really today will focus on some of the process of writing, and there will be some time at the end, by the way, for the audience to ask questions. I've decided to run this like an exam. I thought Ron would be most comfortable with that. But it's time to renew. So, recertify yourself. And what I'd like to do, Ron, is start with what I call my true-false multiple choice questions to give us really a snapshot of you as a writer. When this event was first publicized, I started getting notes from people saying, ask him about. And so I'm channeling a lot of different people here with some very basics about your writing. So these are truly meant to be just quick snapshots. First of all, do you write on a computer or do you write longhand?
Well, initially I wrote longhand because when I started I didn't have a computer. So that was through the hands. So I had to write a draft, and then I had to type it, and then retype it with each draft. Then about, let's see, about 10 years ago, I started working with a computer, and notice my production has gone up. So right now, I write with a computer. In fact, I've become what I tell some of my students, computer dependent. You know, I can't write unless I boot up and see the cursor. Huh? You know, like even if I'm writing a letter. You know, so I write with a computer, and it's fun actually, more fun writing with a computer than writing by hand, because you can move paragraphs, you can move sections all around. And you can press print and you can see what it looks like. You see, and if you don't like it, you do it over again. So I do write with the computer.
You said that your production went up. Of course, that's a concern of all writing teachers, that production goes up and quality drops.
Well, I'll let the reviewers make that judgment.
Where do you write?
I write at home. I don't try to do any writing at my office here. But the reason why I write at home is that I have 2 desks in my study, and they're both like clear desks, okay? And so I usually line up all of my research documents. For a long time, I used 3x5 cards, and I would transfer my data onto 3x5 cards, and then I would organize them and put them into order. But that was time-consuming. To transfer data onto 3x5 cards. And now with you know, Xerox costs so low, I've been Xeroxing documents, and I've been using these Post-its. So I like will put Post-its through a document, then I'll line up these documents on one table, and then I'll be composing them on the other table. So I work at home, and you know, I'll have like documents and books all over the floor too. So it's like a total kind of experience when I'm writing.
Well, this makes me skip then to another question. How do you keep your fingertips on the document or the idea? If you haven't looked at Ron's books, you'll notice that, for instance, in Strangers, there is at least 100 pages of notes, at least, and all the books are the same. So you have this huge amount of material.
You have to have a really good filing system, okay? Because most of my documents have been Xeroxed. You have to have a good filing system. Also, I tell my students you have to have a good memory. You have to remember, you know, what each document had, huh? And with the Post-it system, like I have a document like that with, you know, a whole bunch of Post-its in it. I'll have to go through all the Post-its each time. It takes more time this way, but I save time by not transferring the data onto 3x5 cards. Yeah, you have to exercise more memory. Also, I do use an outline. So, you know, for my outline, you know, I'll note the important like quotes or the important information that I want to utilize.
So I can't quite conceive here of how your office looks like then. You have these 2 desks.
Yeah.
You have apparently one document with notes on it.
One
And
desk
then,
with
and then do you just
documents.
have filing cabinets everywhere? Where?
Yeah, in the basement.
Are you constantly running up and down stairs?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes under the house too, because you know, some of this research took place a long time ago, and for a long time, this is what this is a technique I developed in graduate school here. You know, I would use these shoe boxes, and I would put the 3x5 cards in order in shoe boxes with titles, okay, topical titles. And I remember when I finished my dissertation, which was published as my first book, A Pro-Slavery Crusade, I had like about 10 shoe boxes filled with these 3x5 cards. And I thought, oh, the PhD has been signed, okay? And then I put that box of, you know, shoe boxes then under the house. That's sort of symbolic, you know, like the book is done. Yeah. But the thing about my work is that, you know, I keep going back to earlier research that I had done, you see. And so sometimes I have to literally crawl under the house to find some of these old documents.
See, we find out things that we probably didn't even want to know. I won't ask if you wear coveralls when you go under the house. Do you have any writing idiosyncrasies or environmental needs? Do Do you write in quiet? Do you have to have music? I remember one of my professors had to write in a room with all the blinds drawn and just a single light on the desk. Do you wear Snoopy slippers?
Well, I wear these fur-lined slippers because it's cold in my study. My study is in the back of my house. It's a spacious, sunny study that has a deck and looks out at a very beautiful garden. And I do have fountains back there so that I can hear water running when I go out if I want to take a break. But I don't have any idiosyncrasies or particular needs of writing. I am a morning person, though. I write in the morning, and however, this isn't always true. I remember when I was writing Hiroshima, my last book. Well, I had a deadline, of course, but it wasn't the deadline. I got so swept away by the topic itself, and it was such a controversial topic at that time because of the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian, and I became tied up with the culture wars, and so I felt this urge, this passion, to finish this book, to try to clarify why the United States actually dropped the atomic bomb, and so I would be getting up at 3 in the morning to boot up. My wife Carol is here, and she can tell you that she would hear the beep beep because our study is right next to our bedroom, so you can hear it. You see, but I'd sneak down there about 3 in the morning because okay, I'll tell you something about this writing process. Sometimes as I'm waking up, and I'm still groggy, I'm not awake yet. It may be that there's certain the side of the brain that is responsible for insights rather than logic is still dominant. I get a lot of my ideas as I'm waking up. Yeah, so I gotta write them down, or I gotta go downstairs and boot up. So I wrote Hiroshima very quickly, but I tell my students that when you get into a writing process here and you get swept into it, it's hard to think about other things.
Well, this actually brings up 50 different questions. Normally, if you're not completely swept up in a book like you were with Hiroshima, do you set aside, say, 2 hours in the morning? Do you have a certain time, or is it just morning and you type or you write until you feel like you're done?
Usually mornings, and sometimes I'll go past lunch if I'm really working on something important and if I'm trying to solve a problem. But I will write sometimes for 8 hours, 10 hours, with just a break for lunch. But it works that way with almost every book. I get absorbed in it. When I was in Hawaii, I was writing Iron Cages, and I would often go jogging or go body surfing. Some of you know that I'm a surfer, right? But I go to the beach like around 4 o'clock. And what's kind of interesting here is that when I'm jogging or when I'm swimming, I'm also still thinking about that chapter that I was working on. And maybe just being out there, away from my desk, enabled me then, to see how pieces of the puzzle come together in a different kind of configuration. So I guess, what I would say to students is, these breaks can be very important in terms of the writing process.
That makes me wonder. I remember when I was a graduate student here, there was a professor whose name will not pass my lips today, who would interrupt graduate seminars and pull out a tape recorder and stand in the corner and say a few words and then put it away. And I finally realized that what he was doing was doing things for his book. And so in the course of the day, clearly when you're out there body surfing, you aren't pulling out a pad. But do you keep track? Do you write things down? How do you keep track of the ideas as they come to you?
I do keep a journal. And for this journal, I'll copy down something that I may have read in a newspaper, in a book, but I'll also jot down ideas that I have. And with this journal, and when I teach a research seminar, I ask my students to also keep a journal. The journal has 2 sides to it. Okay, so on one side I'll write down ideas and information, but I'll leave the left side blank. And what I do then is that I go back and I reread my journal. And then more ideas might explode in my mind, and then I'll write these ideas on the left-hand side, you see. So even with, you know, if you take the Hiroshima book, I can show you the journal, and you can see where, you know, a lot of the conceptualization, you find a lot of that conceptualization in my journal about 2 years before I actually started writing the book.
That then again makes me wonder, when you're doing a book like that, do you start with a small idea? Do you start with a big idea? Do you have the book mapped out in your mind? Do you know where you're going?
Well, it happens in different ways for different books, but I'll just tell students about one of the books. This is my book entitled Iron Cages. You see, I started teaching at UCLA, and I taught the first Black History course at UCLA. This is in 1967, and I can remember walking into my class, and there would be about 400 students in there. And I saw African-American students, I saw white students. I also saw Mexican-American and Asian-American students. But I can remember after one of the lectures, the student came up to me and he said, "Hey, I'm Chicano, you know." That's the first time I had heard the term Chicano. But then I started to think, you know, I'd like to teach a course on America from a multiracial perspective that would include the stories and the histories of the Chicanos and the Asian American students in my class. And so I developed a new course at UCLA called The History of Racial Inequality in America. Okay, so I began developing these lectures for this course. And these lectures eventually became like the basis for some of the chapters for my book entitled Iron Cages. But at that time, I was just giving lectures, say, on the Mexican-American experience and on the Asian-American experience and the Native American experience. But I didn't have like any kind of broad vision of the book. But then, when I came to Berkeley in '72, I began working with some graduate students in sociology. And one of them introduced me to C. Wright Mills, okay, on the sociological imagination, where he talks about the intersection between biography and history. And then another student introduced me, and these are graduate students in sociology, okay, who were interested in theory. And then another student introduced me to Antonio Gramsci, the idea of cultural hegemony. So what I did was, you know, I also read Weber at this point, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And so I had developed two ideas, the idea of the Republican iron cage, and then the idea of the corporate iron cage. And I took iron cages as a metaphor from Weber, where he talks about the Puritan putting on his shoulders the cloak of the ethic, thinking that he would wear it lightly. But he would not know that that cloak someday would become an iron cage, the cage of corporate capitalism. Okay, so I had two cages, and I had developed then this manuscript that was about 1,000 pages long. Okay, and it was entitled Iron Cages, but I only had two cages at this point, the Republican iron cage and the corporate iron cage. And I share drafts with colleagues a lot. And so anyway, two of my colleagues read this 1,000-page manuscript. One of them is Larry Friedman, who teaches at Indiana University, and the other is Michael Rogan, who at that time lived across the street from me. And I can remember the three of us meeting in a seminar in my study, and we were drinking wine, and we were talking about the manuscript. They were critiquing it, and we were talking about those two cages. And I said, well, there's this, this other reality, and that's the reality of violence against Indians and against the Chinese and so forth. And I said that the violence was kind of demonic, And then, Michael Rogan's eyes lit up, and and so did Larry Friedman's eyes. He said, hey, a third cage, okay? So there wasn't, in other words, an idea that this book would become Iron Cages, you see. In other words, it's just started by looking at specific groups and their experiences and so forth. But then, I was asking, well, how does this all tie together, you see, in something called the history of the United States? And this is where I turned to theory then, Weber, Gramsci, C. Wright Mills, but also to the resonant literature too, to Herman Melville and Moby Dick.
You talked about sharing your writing with other people. A number of people have wanted to know first, how many drafts do you go through, how much do you revise, and then at what point do you pass it on to other people, and what do you expect for them? And I do note, I believe it's, is it Hiroshima? For Carol, companion and collaborator, it seems to me there may be others involved in this.
Collaborators right here. This is Carolyn Takaki. You know, I'm really lucky that, you know, my favorite and my best editor is also my companion and collaborator. I go through many drafts, sometimes as many as 18 drafts for one chapter. And you know, I'm glad Carol has so much patience and also energy, because she goes through these drafts. But what's really important about Carol's feedback is that, well, Carol teaches English, you know, but it's not just a technical kind of criticism, but it's also substantive, where she said, I don't understand this idea. And I think, well, if she can't understand it, you know, I'm going to have to work on it, you see, because I want people to understand my writings, okay? You know, I'm trying to challenge this master narrative, okay, of the Schlesingers of America. So, you know, it's important for me to write clearly and precisely. So I go through a lot of drafts. And what's the whole draft process is really an exciting one for me, because as I'm revising and rewriting, I'm also doing a lot of readings too. And these readings then, you know, give me new ideas, and so I keep incorporating and reconfiguring a book or a chapter. So a lot of students think that when they've written the paper, it's done, but I tell them, like, most of the writing takes place after you've finished writing that paper. It's the revision process. And the revision process can be a community process. You see, you know, I'm interacting with Carol, but I'm also interacting with colleagues and so forth. And we're like growing together, you see, into a book.
Every time you talk, I think of 16 more questions that I hadn't thought of. Do you like to write, or do you like to have written?
Actually, I like to write rather than to have written. It's like after you finish a book, the book takes on a life of its own. You know, it's sort of like it is something apart from you. It's not you. You know, like the process, you know, ceases. And there is some kind of, you know, feeling of loss too, you see. What I find is when I'm writing, that's when I feel most alive. Like right now, I'm not writing a book now. And so, you know, I'm kind of down, huh? You know, yeah. It's like something in my life is missing here, you see. I do have another book project, but I'm only doing readings now and doing research and so forth and thinking, but I'm not intensely involved in writing. And I miss it, okay? And so this is what I'm trying to say. It's that actual engagement, you know, that stirs me. So when a book is done, you know, there is a sense of loss here. But then on the other hand, the upside of this is that there's this feeling of sharing then, you see. You know, sharing what you've written. And, you know, that can be really gratifying too. I remember when I wrote this book on plantation life and labor in Hawaii. This is where I actually began to think of myself as a writer for general readers as well as for academics. But I was writing Iron Cages. This was in 1977 in Hawaii. And I would often visit my uncle, Uncle Richard, a favorite uncle. And he was sort of proud of his nephew because I'm the first one in my family to go to college and to graduate and even to have a PhD and to be teaching at a world-class university. So I was telling him about Iron Cages, and he was listening very intently. And we would do this again and again, you know. I would stop by his house, and we would sit in the backyard and drink beer and talk story. Well, one day, as I was telling him about Iron Cages, his eyes kind of lit up, and he said, "Hey, Ronald, why you not go write a book about us, huh? In very mellifluous pidgin. He said, after all, your grandparents came over here as contract laborers. Your mother was born on the plantation. All your aunties and uncles were born on the plantation. Why you only write about those folks on the mainland? And so he asked me to write a book about the plantation experience in Hawaii. So I did the research for this book, and as I was writing it, I thought, gee, I want to write a book that my Uncle Richard would want to read and find interesting. So I had to write it in a different way, and this is the first time I tried to write narrative history with storytelling, and to weave then poems and songs into a narrative that I was constructing. And anyway, when this book was published in Hawaii, it was received very gladly by plantation laborers, retired people. I can remember going to plantations to give readings of Pauhana, and these old plantation workers would come up to me and thank me for writing their book, So that's the upside of completing a book. It's like, you've shared something with a community then, you see. So that's the Pauhana experience.
Since you've sort of plunged into that, though, I'd like to talk about some of the things in some of these books for at least a few minutes. I confess that my reading of history is not extensive. We'll get that out of the way to begin with here. Yet when I'm reading one of your books, for instance, Strangers, you'll startle me in a number of ways. And one of the ways that you'll startle me is that in the middle of something you will say something like, my aunt worked in the mill. Students are taught history and I don't mix. So talk to us and about your use of that, about introducing yourself into the books.
You see, in that book, I'm writing a history of Asian Americans, and I'm part of this history, you see. And I want to know, like, how does this history of my group then connect to the history of the United States? And so I view myself as also a storyteller. I have stories to tell. In fact, I was telling you earlier about going under the house to get documents. Well, when I was composing the section on Nisei mothers, Nisei would be American-born, second generation Japanese Americans. And my mother was Nisei. And so I was trying to describe how Nisei mothers wanted their children to go to college, okay, to get an education. This was their hope, you see, to get away from the plantation. And so I had quotes from different Nisei mothers on my cards, okay? But then I started to think, hey, my mother's Nisei, And the thing about it is I went to the College of Worcester in Ohio. Imagine me flying all the way from Hawaii to Ohio. That was a culture shock, But my mother, who only had an 8th grade education, began writing letters to me, you see. And we had never done this before. And she wrote me every week. And these were long and beautiful letters. I didn't realize that my mother was a writer. So I kept her letters, okay? And yet I can show you like a whole carton of her letters that she sent me over 4 years at the College of Worcester. And so anyway, what I did was, as I was writing this one section about Nisei mothers, I said, hey, I have letters from my own mother, So I crawled under the house and I found her letters. And so I quoted from her letters, you see, telling me about, how she had hopes for me to get a college and so forth. In that case, if you look at the footnotes, you'll see, Carolyn Takaki, to Ronald.
Let me just clarify what he says is that we're talking here about using I and referring to himself, but in the passage, he doesn't say this is a letter from my mother.
Right.
He says a Nisei mother writes to her son in college, and then it takes a sleuth to discover that in the footnotes 93 it simply says letters from my mother. Yeah. So why did you choose then, in that case, since you do use I, why did you choose not to identify yourself in the passage?
I'm not sure why I chose not to identify myself there particularly, because I could have, I guess. I'm not sure why I didn't. I guess at that point it became almost too personal for me, to say, oh, this was my mother telling me, study hard and so forth. And also she was telling me about how life was so hard for her. We had a restaurant, and she had to work 7 days a week, no vacations, and she had like 12-hour days. They were they were self-employed, and she said, I would come home and I find your letter in my mailbox, but I would water all the plants first and have dinner and just save your letter because I wanted to read it, after the whole day was done. And I thought, oh, this is too personal now, Yeah, I really didn't want to tell the reader this was my mother, who had such a tough life. So I thought, well, I'll put in the footnotes, and the people who want to find out who this mother is can find it in the footnotes. I think maybe that's the reason why I did it. Yeah.
Throughout your books, you weave in huge numbers of anecdotes, stories, poems, songs, and you do it in a variety of different ways. And of course, you've made my life very difficult because I teach my students that if you're going to use a quotation, you must say, as so-and-so said, and then use a colon and footnotes. Yet you don't always do that, no. And it's quite wonderful, actually. They spoke pidgin English, and as they watched their children grow up in the camps and attend American schools, they realized that they had become settlers and that Hawaii had become their home. And then there's a poem. With one woven basket alone I came, now I have children and even grandchildren too. Can you talk about why you choose to put them in that way?
Yeah, well, I did it for an artistic reason. It is disrupting to say, oh, as so-and-so wrote, with one woven basket alone I came. Now I have children and grandchildren too. But I think there may be another reason for this particular one. I think that was a song, a plantation work song, so it did not have an author, you see. These were songs created by the community. But there will be instances where I do know who the author is, but it sort of like breaks the flow of my narrative, you see, to identify the author in that specific instance. So, but I thought, well, I'm doing this for an artistic reason, but if a reader wants to find out where that quote came from, it's in the footnotes.
You talked about achieving a certain style or flow. I think that if you look at your body of work from beginning to end, that while you manage a variety of different styles, clearly for different audiences, your essay on To Count or Not to Count and From Different Shores is really a masterpiece of clarity and logic to me. But generally you have moved to a much more, what I would call lyrical style in your writing. And again, is that something conscious? Something you've strived for?
It's deliberate. I've written analytical essays. I've engaged the social scientists like Charles Murray, Nathan Glazer, and so I have to write these analytical pieces. But I'm thinking that not that many people read our academic scholarship. Okay, yeah, and as I said, in my opening, what I'm striving toward is a counter master narrative. You see. And that's what I tried to do in A Different Mirror, a counter-master narrative, so that we can look at America differently, you see, and see how we're complicated, we're contradictory, we're complex, and we're also diverse. But that there are, some themes and some principles that do hold us together as Americans, but we keep redefining American principles, you see. I'm not going to tell you about it. You're going to have to read the book, okay? But this book is intended to challenge Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And in fact, the book must be making an impact because I've been invited to debate Arthur Schlesinger Jr. by the Council on Foreign Relations in New York in May. You see, so in other words, there is a culture war underway, and I think that scholars like myself can't just write books about specific groups like Asian Americans, or write books that are regionally focused like Hawaii, or even write books like just Iron Cages about hegemony, and white and the structures of American society. We also have to write, a larger narrative of who we are as Americans from many different shores, and how when we examine our past, we'll see that many of our paths have crisscrossed one another. You see, and it becomes like an exciting, a vibrant. It's Whitman's America, huh? It was Whitman who said, "Of every hue and caste I am, I resist anything better than my own diversity."
I still have 543 questions. I want to leave some time for everyone else, so let me ask two questions, and one of them has to do with endings. If I can find the ending. It seems to me that, as you yourself read, you read the end about Moby Dick, that it's not just the ends of books, but it's the ends of chapters seem to have a special power. They don't just end and then you move on to the next. This is from the end of the chapter on Jewish immigration. But as they made their place in the promised land called America, they fearfully watched the rise of an evil empire in Europe that would lead to a defining moment in Jewish history. A horror awaited their brethren, and the discovery of the Holocaust would never allow Jews in America or anywhere else to forget who they were. Their Jewish identity would be seared in their hearts. And to me, that's just typical of your endings. Do you devote special?
Yeah. Well, you're a teacher of writing. The most important parts of an essay are the introduction and then the conclusion. Huh? That's what will engage the reader, but also at the end, that's what the reader will remember. Huh? So I work especially hard on the openings and closings of chapters. Yes, that's part of the artistry, I think. But same thing with the opening and closing of books. You see.
So my final question, and then we'll have some time for everyone else, is what should I have asked you about your writing that I didn't?
Well, you've covered a lot of territory. I don't know what you should have asked me. I guess, I would have asked probably, well, how does your writing, connect to your political vision? You see, because I tried to explain that in the beginning, that I write for a political purpose. You see, to challenge this master narrative that I think is leading to the disuniting of America. And as I said, it's in the air. We don't even think about it, but we think this way. You see, we're not conscious of it. But also, it's practiced then in terms of UC admissions policies and so forth. But we don't even think about what's underlying it in terms of, our understanding of American history. I think I think that there is a kind of deep political urgings within me that connect me to my writing, and but then I don't know if we wanted to get into that because we really wanted to talk about the writing process. You see. Because once we get into the deep political urgings, then we are talking about history and sociology and American society. Huh?
But I think your point is that your writing can't really be separated from those other things. I think is, of course, something that everyone in the room should remember. The writing has to come from some other source.
And also the importance of context. I'm influenced by my context. Okay, I was here during the free speech movement, and that's what got me started, in the study of racism. But even for A Different Mirror, I was writing that book at the time when this faculty was debating the proposal for an American cultures requirement. Remember, it was a 2-year debate. It started in 1987, ended in 1989. Huh?
And it was during that debate then that some people said, oh, are we going to just have courses that study peoples of color? And somebody said, well, what about Jews? You know, what about European immigrants? And we revised the proposal, and we said, okay, you know, there's going to be a fifth category, European immigrant groups. And here, you know, I had already pretty much, you know, done the research for this book, and so I thought, gee, I'm going to have to add some European immigrants. And so I added the study of Jewish immigrants and also Irish immigrants. But that helped me then to re-see almost everything else in the book, because even if you look at the first chapter on Indians, notice what happened to Sir Walter Raleigh when he arrived on the shores of Virginia. He said, oh, these Indians remind me of the wild Irish, you see. You know, I would have missed that quote, you see, had it not been for the American culture's requirement and the struggle over it, you see. So context is very important. That's what I keep telling my students, you know. The fact that you're here at Berkeley is very important in terms of the way you're going to think and also the way you're going to see the world and the way you're going to write about the world.
And we want to know whether that quote was in the shoebox under the house. We do have some time, so we just throw this open if people have questions. And if I can't hear you, I'll repeat them for the camera.
Yeah.
In your writings, you do a lot of ethnography. Talking to, for example, plantation workers in Hawaii. And I'd like to know how you'd advise us to go about that process of taking into account primary sources, informants, and not only being true to their voice in the writing, but also the process of getting the information that you want from them.
Well, if you look at the footnotes, you know, I did some of the interviews, but a lot of those interviews were done by oral history projects, like especially the project in Hawaii. So you do have, and some of them were done by the Bancroft Library here. You know, in other words, there are other ethnographers that I had to rely upon, but I did some interviews, and mainly these were not done systematically. If I, you know, happen to like meet somebody, say in Hawaii, and he or she was a plantation worker, you know, I talked to them and asked them, oh, you know, when did you come here, or something like that, and then you know, I take some notes. Many of these interviews were with friends and also family members, because I think they're part of history too, you see. But I think the main thing that I tried to do was to try to see history in terms of people from the bottom up, and to view them as men and women with minds and wills and also voices. Voices are very important, you see, to me. For example, in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly, you have this article, very important article on Clinton's Welfare Reform Act and the devastating impact it will have upon poor people. But there are no poor people quoted in that entire article. Okay, they're voiceless. Okay, so they remain objects then. And I wish she had quoted, you know, some of these mothers who will be losing their support and so forth, and the painful problems that they're facing here. What about child support? And then a lot of these are legal immigrants who will be losing food stamps, okay? But I wish, like, this author in the Atlantic Monthly had included some of their voices, because then you realize that, hey, we're not just talking about, you know, numbers on welfare. We're talking about real people, lives, and that these people have feelings, but they also have ideas, and they have some strategies too. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to let the people themselves, you know, tell us about their experiences. But my role as a historian is to also contextualize those experiences and those stories, you see. So, you know, I am the narrator. What I do is I retell stories through my own story.
Okay. I wish a lot of the regressive reformers had the same kind of sensibility that you do. I appreciate your heart.
Right. Yeah, back there.
Professor, I
I ever?
Never get out from under your house for a story?
Would I write a biography of my mother?
Yes.
Yeah, well,
What easy achieving?
yeah, no, you know, I can't. I would not be able to write it. I would not write a biography of my mother. It's too personal. But also it's pretty painful too. You know, okay? I don't want to say any too much about my mother. You know.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. And you know, I'm a historian, right? You know, like you know, I'm not a biographer. But it's mainly too personal. Yeah.
There's a question.
Maybe that's the reason why I footnoted her rather than included her in the text. Yeah, question over here?
Yeah, hi. You talk about writing kind of a counter or master narrative, and you talk about how the master narrative is kind of all around us.
Yeah.
In trying to do some of the same things, the problem I find is you're kind of like in a fun house, and you're looking back and you see these images of yourself, but they're not really the image that you see because you're seeing it through the lens of culture. How do you step outside of that?
Yeah, that is a problem because you know we've all been like through the school systems, and we've all read these books written by the Arthur Schlesinger Juniors of America. So we do have that lens, okay, even though we might have a PhD. But you know the culture is you know the master narrative is dominant, but the domination is not complete. You know, we're always interrogating and questioning that dominance. And now with multiculturalism, we've been able to at least disrupt that narrative. But you see, much of our scholarship has been group specific, say books on blacks or books on Asian Americans, or they've been episodic, like they've been looking at a particular period in American history. Okay, but nevertheless, I think like because of the new scholarship, the critical scholarship, you know, we were asking new kinds of questions, you see, about what is American history? How do we study American history? So although, you know, we're not completely free from this, I think, you know, we still are in resistance against it. Maybe the metaphor is brushing against the grain, okay? You know, there is an American grain, and it's a powerful grain. As I said, it's in the air. Huh? But what we as critical intellectuals can do is to brush against that grain, you see. And that's what I've been trying to do in my work, to brush against the grain.
Yeah, sometimes my writing flows and sometimes it doesn't. And so sometimes I have to sneak up on things, so to speak. How do you sneak up on things?
Well, I write very fast. Okay, and what happened was this, you know, many of my chapters were initially lectures, okay, and you know, I told you I went to UCLA to teach the first Black History course, so I had to do a lot of readings to teach this course, you know, and so I'd be, in terms of knowledge, maybe a week ahead of the students, okay, be reading 3 or 4 books about Marcus Garvey, and I had to give a lecture on Marcus Garvey the next week, so I'd have to write furiously, you know, that lecture on Marcus Garvey. So that's how I sneak up on it, you know. Yeah. So like, you know, I tell my students, like, I can write a chapter in almost a day if I want to. But then it's mainly the like this, you know, the main edifice of the chapter, huh? And it's a draft. But you know, again, I'm prepared to go through 18 revisions, you see, before it's a final version, huh? But I just push myself and I write, you know, and I try to finish. And now with the computer, it's really fun, you know, to press print and you see it coming out, oh wow, that's what it looks like. You think, oh man, this looks terrible, you know. Yeah. But I think that's what I tell my students, you know, like, don't worry about it, just write. Huh? You know, especially graduate students. You know, who are writing their dissertations, you know, I want a chapter by next week. So, you know, just write it. You know.
I was looking at your Hiroshima book at the index, and I was wondering why you did not include any of the local groups of people who invented or developed the bomb.
why I didn't include in the index who?
I don't see any of the names of all the Berkeley scientists.
They're in there. Yeah. Edward Teller is in there. Yeah. Oppenheimer is in there. Oppenheimer features very largely. In fact, after the war, Oppenheimer was a professor of physics here, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he became the director of the Los Alamos lab. And when he stepped down as director, the president of UC Berkeley went to Los Alamos, to congratulate him. And also they took the Cal marching band to Los Alamos. And so that was a kind of ironical moment, because here they were under the blue sky of Nevada, and Cal was saying, oh, look what we contributed, huh? We contributed atomic bomb, we helped to end the war. But yet at that very moment, Oppenheimer was having deep misgivings about the bomb, you see. He said, what have we unleashed here, you see? And actually, many of the atomic scientists tried to stop the bombing. They signed a petition asking Truman not to drop the bomb on Japan. They said, look, we developed this bomb because we thought Germany would have a bomb, you see. There's no longer a nuclear threat to the United States. Japan has already lost the war. It has no navy, it has no air force. What's the point of dropping the bomb? So these scientists signed this petition. And J. Oppenheimer, after the war ended, went in to see Truman, and he said to President Truman, he said, look, I have blood on my hands, I think we made a mistake, And then Truman said, here, you want to use my handkerchief, to wipe that blood off your hands? He said, don't worry about that, I'm the one who made the decision. Huh? But the scientists are in this book, okay? But then you realize that, hey, the University of California has continued this relationship, with the development of nuclear weapons. Huh? When you think of Lawrence Livermore Lab and so forth. Read the book. You realize that our own scientists themselves had great and deep ambivalence about what they had created and how their creation had been used.
That in that book, just the section you were talking about actually produces one of your finest short lines, I think, when you say that Truman inherited from Roosevelt not a policy but a slogan. And I've always thought that really opened up my eyes about that period.
Well, the slogan was unconditional surrender, you see. What happened is that Roosevelt and Stalin, Churchill, saw that the war in Europe had to be brought to an end on basis of unconditional surrender. They wanted to make sure that Germany would never be able to rise again. Okay, this is the second time that Germany had started a war. And so anyway, they came up with this idea of unconditional surrender, okay? And then Roosevelt decided then to extend this to Japan, but that was kind of like an afterthought. And that became the slogan, unconditional surrender. And then Truman then, when he confronted Japan, said that you must surrender unconditionally, or else we're going to destroy you. Well, Japan thought unconditional surrender meant that meant the destruction of the emperor system, and so Japan refused to surrender. Even after the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese government still did not surrender. Okay, until Truman then made a concession, and he said, "Yeah, Japan may keep its emperor." But why make that concession after dropping 2 atomic bombs? We could have made the concession earlier, and maybe peace would have come earlier without the unleashing of 2 atomic bombs. So, in fact, our Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, was urging Truman to include in the Potsdam Declaration a provision that would have allowed Japan to keep its emperor, and that provision was struck out. And Stimson said this is going to delay the end of the war, and he knew that this was going to mean the use of atomic weapons. And Stimson then said in his diary, I read his Stimson diary, he said, our policymakers know nothing about Japan except what they've learned from Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. Think about that, entertainment now influencing American foreign policy. But I think that underscores my opening point, how we need a counter-master narrative, you see, to show that Americans are diverse. We've come from many different shores. and also for us to become more multiculturally knowledgeable, okay? And not to depend on Gilbert and Sullivan, the Mikado, for our information about Japan. But you know, just think of the horrible tragedy that unfolded here. Yeah. Well,
Do you suffer from writer's block? And if you do, what do you do? I mean,
yeah, do I suffer from writing? Yeah, sometimes. Right.
what do you do then?
Oh, I go jogging or go for a swim. But mainly what I do is I write something down anyway, you know, even if it doesn't look good, huh? Write it down. Because then I see what's out there, you see. You know, also I show it to Carol, you know. Yeah. And, you know, we argue a lot, actually, you know, yeah. But we're still together. But, you know, Carol would criticize me and say, you know, like, oh, that opening paragraph, you know, doesn't work for me, you know, and go, you know, that's kind of like a block, you know, well, how do I do this? So Carol will come up with some suggestions, but sometimes I'll accept them, sometimes I won't. But sometimes, like, I'll think of a third way to do it, huh? But I think the main thing, if you feel a block, is to write, so that you can at least see what you have there, and to work with that, you see. Because let's say, you know, we have our images and ideas in our mind, right? And the writing process means to put it out there on paper. So put it out there on paper, and then look at it and criticize it. Yeah, back there?
And then that should be our last question,
Okay.
I think.
Well, recently, UC Regent Warren Farley has suggested that names be removed from UC applications because they give an indication of what race or ethnicity the student is. And what is your opinion on that?
Well, I guess I invited that because I mentioned Ward Carnley earlier. And, you know, I was talking about how there is this master narrative, you know, and it's everywhere, it's pervasive, it's in the air, this idea that America is the sweet land of liberty, equality, democracy. And so anybody can make it here on an individual basis, regardless of race, okay? And so that's consistent then with this attack on affirmative action. This master narrative is saying, oh, we should judge everybody on the basis of individual merit, you see. No, and so you know, it is logical then to take that next step. Oh, well, why shouldn't we erase all the names then of students who apply to the University of California so that we can just judge them on an individual basis? Well, you know, apparently there are lots of problems with this because these students also write essays, right, personal essays, and they talk about themselves. So you'd be able to find out, you know, whether the student was an Asian American or Chicano and so forth in the personal essay. So the other thing is that, like, you know, sometimes you can find out by just looking at the zip code, you know. In fact, banks do that. They look at zip codes to determine whether or not to give you a loan or something like that, you see. So the zip code is another coded way to find out, you know, what is your class and what is your ethnicity. What's the point of trying to, you know, artificially then hide the ethnic identities of students? But I think there's the other side to this, and that's what I'm trying to say, is that, you know, there is a counter master narrative that we have been diverse, and that racism, you know, has been a very powerful force in American history. I know there's this new book out by Samuel Huntington called The Clash of Civilizations, you know, where he says that America has to get ready for this clash of civilizations, especially clash with Chinese civilization and Muslim civilization. And in order for us to prepare for this clash, we need to become more homogeneous, okay, culturally. And he says that multiculturalism and immigration threaten this homogeneity. But that's dangerous kind of thinking, and you know, you can see where this might be the framing of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War world, you see. But what it is that I think that, you know, and he says that Western civilization gave birth to the great ideas of liberty, you know, equality, justice, democracy. But you have to also remember that out of Western civilization also came colonialism, you know. But I mean, in 1800, you know, Europe controlled, what, 35% of the globe's surface. You know, by 1900, European countries controlled 80% of the globe's surface, okay? You know, so that came out of Western civilization too. And when you think about white supremacy, that came out of Western civilization. In fact, there's this book called Modernity and the Holocaust, you know, where this Zygmunt Bauman is saying that, you know, the whole idea of the Holocaust comes out of Western civilization. The idea of the Enlightenment, of human perfectibility, and the use of science to achieve human perfectibility. So, you know, it's not over yet, is what I'm trying to say. But when you look at Western civilization, don't look at it as something that's homogeneous and coherent. You know, it's filled with contradictions, okay? It might be like a place that gave birth to the idea of liberty, but it also constituted the site for the development of racism, too.
I know people have places to go. We could continue this all afternoon. I hope, Ron, you'll stay around for a few minutes and maybe people can talk to you individually. I'd like to point out that the ASUC bookstore has some of Ron's books here for sale. I'd also like to thank very much the Morrison Room for supporting this, and the Dean of Undergraduate and Interdisciplinary Studies for helping us through this. And especially thank you, Ron, for giving us your time. It's been really wonderful. And look for this series next fall. Again, we're going to be doing this once a semester. But Ron, thank you very much.